Well, ladies and gentlemen, we're well on time here, which gives us lots of time for questions. I think we've had a really great and varied take at the question, and it seems that we have quite happily and spontaneously come at it from three quite different perspectives. Professor Vego started off giving us a bit of an intellectual structure of the question, and I think this is absolutely important, because in the same way that design starts with understanding the requirement, answering a question like this starts with understanding the question. Dr. Chung then followed up, and with the particular example of China, has highlighted some of the aspects of the process of generating new technology. A lot of people think that the technology is generated spontaneously out of some mysterious process of imagination and invention, not realizing that, or not perceiving, if they're not directly involved in it, how innovation itself is a strategic choice and requires strategic commitment and impetus. And Admiral Murdoch has followed up with the home lap, and has very rightly drawn a tight bead on the role of technology, the essential role of technology as the enabler of the war fighter. And so, at the end of the day, if it doesn't help the warfighter with their essential business at the sharp end, then it may be all very interesting and curious, but it maybe isn't worth the expense. So with that, I think I'll open the floor to questions. The topic here, I think, is largely one of many different juxtapositions and compromises, and so I think there's plenty of opportunity for questions there. So, start off.
Good evening. My name's Commander Wood. I'm Canadian Naval officer.
Please stand close to the microphone.
All right. Thank you, sir. Commander Wood, Canadian Navy. My question is for Rear-Admiral Murdoch. Having looked at some of the crewing changes or concepts that happen in some of the new classes of ships that have been introduced, there has been a lessons learned about the actual endurance of some of those small crews. And I think your Navy and others are experiencing the need to sort of repopulate some of these lighter crewed ships so that they can go a little further, fight a little longer, and actually fight further, longer, survive. And recent experience in our Navy has shown that the ability to respond to emergencies is really fundamentally based on the depth of your crew as much as the quality of your crew. So could you speak to a little bit about some of the lessons learned that you've had from migrating from these lighter ships to ones that are more sustainable and of greater endurance?
It's a great question, and as I might have indicated, I've come quite around in my thinking on how you determine the right crew. We absolutely started with analysis that said, what's the endurance of our key watchstanders? And how long can a small crew, we started with 40 people in the core crew on the littoral combat ship designs. Pretty small number. We had a requirement established that the crew size had to be somewhere between 15 and 50. And we ended up with, after some analysis by one of our partners, we ended up with 40. And there's a relation between how many people you have, obviously, and how long they can operate the ship in a sustained manner, both on watch at a high state of readiness. That was one consideration we looked at. And then the other thing was, how long can they deploy? So we immediately discovered you can't have a roughly 40-man crew do a 6 to 8 month deployment. They just won't be able to sustain that pace. And we came up with the idea that we would rotate the crews every 4 months. And so we put that into practice. And a few years ago, before we sent Freedom to Singapore, our CNO told us in the program team, I want to see Freedom go over there for at least 8 months. I want to test the sustainment strategy. I want to do at least one crew swap, because I have in my head that crew swaps are hard. We do them in ballistic missile submarines. We've tried it with crew swaps on surface ships. There's a lot of training and administrative aspects to it. What we found was that there were unexpected areas, all related to technology, where we had to add people. And surprisingly, the guys that weren't getting any sleep weren't necessarily the engineers, you know, and I grew up, I was nuclear trained, I interviewed with Rick Over, was in propulsion for years and years and years. But what we found was that, you know, a surface combatant, we had too small of a combat systems department. So that was one revelation. And the other thing was IT. Let me comment briefly on cyber, okay? It's an opportunity and it's a threat. And if you have systems on ships that use a lot of commercial software with commercial basis, the acquisition bean counters love you because it's cheap, but it's very vulnerable. So another area where we were short in manpower was we had people tied up entering patches to computer network equipment. And we had to actually augment that. So it's difficult to accurately estimate, but I commend the thinking of the Royal Canadian Navy as I've studied where we're headed in what you're doing today in the Halifax class and the crew size, and then where I think you're headed with Canadian Surface Combatant. For the operational requirement that you want and the future that you want to have, don't stint on the manpower if you can possibly get away with it. If you can afford a crew size that's perhaps a little bit larger than what we've essayed to do, I think that's wise. We did find that there were unexpected areas in emphasizing a small crew, and analysis won't always disclose that. When you actually build, you end up finding something different. Thanks.
Thanks, Ferit Karkov, CDAI. Listening to you, is technology the ultimate equalizer provided there's the right funding, or is it the ultimate divider? And to what extent is there really a catching up by China with all the investment it makes, or the advantage of the US will always remain, at least in the foreseeable future?
That's a very good question itself. What you see with the Chinese leadership and the military leaderships today, especially in the last decades, there's this code of technology itself that they think that if they can catch up itself and they can sort of like become like an established power itself. But the way that they're doing this is that they're doing this in a very efficient approach, because when they look at technological development and how to develop technology, their focus right now for the Chinese Navy is what they call the just good enough approach itself. They're not trying to catch up with the very best that the US or other countries have itself, but they want good enough that is able to be sustained by their human talent pool itself, by like their indigenous capabilities. And that is where they're focused on absorbing foreign technologies itself. That's their near to medium term strategy, the next 5, 10, 15 years. Their long term focus is to get to do what the US and other countries do, is what they define as the gold-plated approach to innovation and technology development, where you pour in lots of funding and you focus even on frontier type of technology. They've got a very, very long way to go before they get there. They want to do that itself, but that's a long-term strategy itself. So their focus right now, especially in terms of the operational developments, is have a good enough approach. But they are, when you look at their R&D apparatus itself, their basic research, their 6.1, 6.2 areas, they're pouring lots of money on emerging technologies itself. But they know that's going to take a fairly long time before they can begin to reap those rewards. So technology is extremely important for them, but they are fairly careful in not putting all their eggs in one basket and trying to achieve the very high-end technology development.
Yeah. Professor Vego, would you like to add?
Chinese have done better than many Western navies really in embracing operational art, what they call science of campaign. And if you read open sources, you will see very detailed analysis of the operations, whether land, air, and the Navy. I think one advantage, in my judgment at least, is that really try very hard to integrate offensive, defensive information warfare in all their operations. and said that should not be underestimated. I don't know to which extent they will be successful in real combat, but I think they had done much more theoretical work than we have done. Because, for example, in the naval context, sea control, sea denial, you need to, one of the prerequisites is really to obtain information dominance, And I think they have done a better job than we have been doing. Just not technology, but also what I call operational art too.
Good afternoon, Dave Bindernagel, Canada. My question may relate to one of Dr. Vego's slides, which linked the lack of operational thinking to Western navies of today. I would put that in spite of some traditional naval arm races that we're witnessing, it would seem to me that the threat to many navies of today is coming more from non-state agents who have lots of money and access to the latest off-the-shelf anti-ship weapons. So my question is, how are current navies and nations adjusting to that threat?
I'm not sure how we are. I think in terms of theory, I don't think that any Navy really has a well-developed, comprehensive theory, what I call operation short of war. Most of our theoretical knowledge really deals with combat, with really conventional war at sea. And I would say that we have not, I would just mention one thing. When you look, at our operations in Gulf of Aden, from my judgment, was too much emphasis on anti-piracy and not on counter-piracy. And the real operational perspective would actually require a joint approach, go and after the sources of the piracy, that means go ashore, doing, making raids, things like that. We have not done that. We have now much more manageable situation in Gulf of Aden, than was before, But I think it was very clear to me that was all tactical and was also really looking, searching for ship or convoying and so on, but not really the joint approach in order to deal with combating piracy. And I think the similar situation is with combating terrorism is really a more tactical approach than is an operational perspective approach, I think.
Yeah. Jim, do you have something to add?
I would add on that when it comes to defending your own warship against the, say, for example, a coastal cruise missile that might have been acquired by a terrorist organization. We've seen some examples of that over the past 5 years. Defeating that threat is a challenge, but it's a measurable and achievable challenge for most combat systems designs and point defense missiles that are out there. The broader challenge against those threats is the challenge to merchant shipping and the effect that the chilling effect on commerce and the motion of merchant shipping when that sort of operation gets underway. And I would argue that, as has been the case and will continue to be the case, the way you have to defeat that is very similar to the operations, the coalition operations that are going on today. When you have a threat like that emerge, you've got to be able to defend yourself against it. If you're a naval unit that got attacked, that's one challenge. We understand that challenge pretty well. But you then need to be able to get good threat warning and intelligence and get in and root out and destroy that problem before it has broader impact on the global commons, the ocean commons in areas like the Strait of Hormuz. And that argues for a broader coalition approach, a joint force approach of both sea and air assets and everything from the carrier strike group ranging down to what other partner navies can do. Thanks.
A question to Tai Ming-Shung and a question to Admiral Murdoch. Tai Ming-Shung, you showed us a photograph of the Luoyang 2, Luoyang 3 destroyers.
Can you speak up a little bit, please?
Excuse me?
Speak up a little bit, please.
Yes, excuse me. You showed us a photograph of the Luoyang 2, Luoyang 3 destroyers. In the official history of the Russian Sevenoye Design Bureau, they claim some degree of paternity for that class of ship. So this was not really in the press. Do you have any ideas of the Russian cooperation with China, even when this cooperation is not, I would say, made public in the press? So that is my question for you. And the question for Admiral Murdoch is about the Danish modular patrol boats. They are all decommissioned now. But have you learned anything from their experience? As I understood, those patrol boats were specialized and not modular during their lifetime. Thank you.
That's a very interesting question. In terms of both the Luyan and whether it's a lot of other naval programs, especially the aircraft carrier programs, the Chinese Navy has, because this focus on technology transfers and foreign absorption for their IDAR strategy, they've depended significantly on the Russians and, of course, the Ukrainians in particular. And so with the Luyan, the Luyan now, there's several types. It's like from the Luyan 1 to the latest one, 3, the A, B, C, and D versions. What we saw that in the earlier versions, the overwhelming emphasis was on importing foreign technologies, these component parts itself, and they'll put it together. And so what the Chinese shipyards would mostly do is that they'll build the hulls itself, and most of the technologies within it would come from foreign sources, whether it's Russians, the Ukrainians, or some of the Western countries, which we won't name itself. But as they've absorb these types of capabilities in the last few years itself, the level of indigenization has begun to increase itself, so that by the time of the latest, the Luyan 3, the D class, I think, what we're seeing is that there's a tipping point now where the Chinese are saying that the majority of what they have is now indigenized, that it's like, it's not necessarily coming from China itself, but they've actually absorbed it and they've managed to produce it themselves itself. It's what they call, this is what the Chinese call re-innovation, how you combine the foreign with the domestic itself. So that's why it's these foreign technologies, whether they come from Russia or the Ukraine or other countries, have been played a very, very important part, both for the Luyan and for many other classes.
And I think your other question was on what we learned from the Danish designs. Are you referring to the Absalon class? That's what I've looked at, and I would share. Say again? Yeah, patrol boats. No, I haven't really looked at those. I would say we looked at the Absalon because it was a larger and probably more representative example. We did get the insight there, which I'll just share, that I was at a conference several years ago, and we were talking about the cost of ships, which is always too much. And I'm being half in jest, but in particular, we're looking at the cost of DDG 1000 and one of our other programs. And somebody asked the Danish and Dutch shipbuilders who were there, how do we get some cost out of this type of ship? And his simple answer was, you have too many people working on the design. And if you think back to, once again, what Harry Kim said a couple of days ago, having between 10 and 100 people is probably about right. We tend to go into quite a bit of an overkill on that in the United States, perhaps, arguably, but I'll leave that for another discussion. Thanks.
It's Alan Breakspear. I have two comments. In the first one, I'm wearing the hat of a retired federal bureaucrat, and if I can get to the second one, and in that one I'll reserve my previous hat of a former intelligence officer. Yesterday, Admiral Peter Cairns, on behalf of the shipbuilding industry of Canada, gave us a litany of complaints about the problems caused for the Navy and the shipbuilding industry by the decisions that had been made by government. In the early 70s, I was the program officer in Treasury Board concerned to make recommendations to Treasury Board for approval of a capital project called the Canadian Patrol Frigate. We had to thrash out problems of technology creep, or as it was then called, design creep. There was prevalent amongst some of the senior naval officers of the Department of National Defense the belief or understanding or wish that once the capital project had been approved, they would be able to come along and say, there's new technology. Can we reopen the package? And we had to say, no. Unless you're sure that you're going to be able to get a budget increase, or it will be at no cost. My point is that the design problem, the technology problem, the total project problem is not one that is a problem for the Navy alone. There are other bureaucratic entities involved in these decisions. The presentations you've given us today talk only about the Navy. My comment is there's a lot more involved. And sometimes the Navy doesn't fully understand or appreciate or even want to deal with the fact that other bureaucratic entities have responsibilities in these things. Second comment very quickly. Earlier today, I think it was, Dr. Valencia talked about how the Chinese intelligence capability in the South China Sea is a generation or more behind the American capability. Dr. Chung, my question, I guess it is, more than a comment, if that's true, it would seem to be at odds with what you were saying about Chinese technology innovation, and I wonder if you or anyone else is looking at the question of innovative capability in the Chinese intelligence area.
Yeah, can I suggest, Dr. Chung, you take the second question first, and then what I'd like to do is to hear each of the panelists talk on the first comment.
Okay, so I'll take on the second, but I also want to mention the first as well. So on the second question, I mean, I haven't looked in terms of the intelligence capabilities on the C4ISR, although the Chinese defense industry is paying significant focus on that itself. I mean, it's my presentation and a lot of the research that I've shown is that the Chinese are quite far behind. They're about a generation behind. A decade or two ago, they were 2 generations behind. And the emphasis, the focus is on the pace of catching up, which they're accelerating. And I would say that given the amount of resources, given the amount of strategic and leadership attention, they're beginning to narrow the gap, and they're narrowing it much more quickly than outside analysts had expected itself. But there's significant problems in that itself. So I've painted a fairly positive picture if you're a Chinese in terms of all the resources, but there are really fundamental organizational problems within the Chinese system that I didn't have time to talk about. And that's to do with the first question, where it's like the Navy looks at this from a Navy perspective, but there's a lot of organizations involved, and a lot of them, they don't talk to each other, and they fight. And in many ways, the Chinese are using a brute force approach. If they spend enough, they can make those gaps. But if the spending begins to significantly decrease itself, a lot of the structural problems within the Chinese system may begin to really slow down their ability to go at technological innovation with the pace that they have been.
Yeah. So, Professor Vego, do you have a comment?
First question, it's other bureaucracy. It's not just the Navy itself. Other organizations, bureaucracies are involved, makes it much more complicated.
Well, I think, in terms of the overall, I mean, creativity, military creativity or naval creativity is very difficult because we have parochialism of the services, we have hierarchical organizations, groupthink and so on. These are all impediments, to any creative approach in fielding new or developing new technologies. I think another reason is also, in how I see it, very often you have the high officials, frequently supporting certain systems or certain weapon systems or platforms, And I think by doing that, they're also stifling discussion, not maybe intentionally, unintentionally, and then preventing junior officers or others, to participate and to provide some solution for that, I think creativity in the military organization is much more difficult than the creativity, certainly, of the painter or musicians and so on. So there are a lot of problems with that, And I don't know what the solution is. I think, I recall reading, U.S. Navy, for example, had a very good approach in interwar years where the high officials were not really interfering. They provided the funds and environment free for discussion. I think I found always freedom to think, and to express views on professional matters increasingly difficult. I think that's one of the major problems, I think, in almost all institutions today, I think.
Admiral Murdoch, any comments?
A couple of comments. In all the challenges that I tended to address, having a dispute with what you might call a bureaucrat was typically not a problem for me in U.S. Navy program management. When I presented a logical and fact-based case to argue for budget for a program that I was involved with, I generally got it. Where I ran into problems, and why I keep coming back to my colleagues in the Navy, was that unavoidably, in response to any number of changes, either in the threat or the global climate, you would have changes to the requirement. And it wasn't necessarily requirements creep in the sense that someone in the Navy wanted something better, but perhaps they wanted it different or on a more different timeline. So I would say with complete honesty that I didn't really harbor any distrust or problems with the federal employees who were charged with my oversight. The one area that I would pick up a thread from earlier presentations was that if you don't have a clear contracting strategy, and if you can't execute that contract with your industry partner in a disciplined and a timely manner, you're going to have a problem. So if you don't have enough people on the civilian side for your Department of National Defense or Public Works and Government Services Canada, I think here in country does the contracting. If you can't devote enough resources to executing contract modifications and actions in a timely manner, be careful, because you're going to multiply problems and costs. Industry is not out there to demonstrate malfeasance. We want to demonstrate compliance to the contract, as a program executive, I occasionally found I didn't have enough people to really do good contractual business, so that's the only thought that I would offer you there. I had complete respect for the folks that I worked with.
Admiral.
I'm Admiral retired Nirmal Varma, currently India's High Commissioner to Canada. I have two short questions for Dr. Chuang. You have given us a good insight into technology absorption in the Chinese armed forces. I would like to invite your comments on the human resource pool of the PLA Navy in terms of professionalism of sailors, motivation and morale, officer-sailor relationships, and leadership of the officer corps. That's question one. The second question is that if you read Western commentaries about the operationalization of the new aircraft carrier and carrier aviation per se, there are various assessments that it's the first time the Chinese Navy is, PLA Navy is venturing into carrier aviation, and it would take time. What is your assessment?
Thank you, Admiral. Two very simple questions itself. In terms of the human dimension of all of this itself, the professionalization, especially in terms of the Chinese Navy. That's a very broad area, but I want to focus in terms of the science and technology side, which is where we're focusing upon itself, is that this has been one of the big challenges that the Chinese military and civilian authorities have, is that they realize that the quality, the professionalism of the Chinese military officer and enlisted corps is still quite low. They don't have the training, they lack the experience, and it's going to take a very long time. They've recognized this. They've put in a lot of new programs, a lot of initiatives. They have a proliferation of talent training programs that are taking place. They have some very important initiatives. A few years ago, the PLA overall recognized that they needed NCOs because the non-commissioned officers are the ones that really drive the professionalism of the military. The Chinese PLA did not have an NCO corps until the late 2000s. They began to put that in. It's still taken a significant amount of time before they can really develop that base. But they recognize that's an important priority. They recognize that they need PhDs. They need those technical experts to be able to do all the engineering as well as doing the maintenance. They didn't invest in that. So what they're doing now is that it's a rush against time, where they're trying to cultivate this talent program itself. But it's a finite pool of really good talent itself. Although when we look at China and the numbers of graduates that come out from the Chinese higher education system itself, I mean, I think it's about 10 million graduates every year. The quality of really good students is very, very small. And most of them, they don't want to go into the military itself. They want to go to work for high-tech companies, for foreign firms, etc. So one of the things that they're trying to motivate is this spirit of patriotism and nationalism itself, and they're trying to also to incentivize for them to go into the military. There's higher salaries now, etc. So this all takes a very long period of time. But the Chinese leadership recognizes that at the end of the day, it's all about the human talent itself. The technology is critical, but it's the human talent, which is something that they didn't recognize for quite some time. On the second question about the Chinese aircraft carrier, they've only been out for the last 2 years, and they've been relatively cautious itself. I mean, the interesting thing that I see is that the Liaoning aircraft carrier has done a few training deployments. It's got another few years before they even think about it doing operational itself. But my sense is that they're being extremely cautious. They haven't reported any accidents itself, which is for a Navy who really haven't had any experience flying off aircraft carriers. You would expect that there would be, especially if they want to press the envelope, that they would have some accidents. I mean, failure is always part of getting to success. So to me, it's like they've been extremely cautious in operating and doing what they have done itself. And most of the reporting that's been done in the Chinese military press sort of has been much more of a propaganda style itself. So I'm still not quite sure that they've really been able to grasp how you really operate an aircraft carrier, especially on an operational side. It's mostly from a very incremental training side right now.
That actually tails very well into my question. I own half a plank, so to speak, of a ship, a first of class, which introduced major new capabilities into the German Navy, Thorsten Bochentin from Germany. And what I missed until this question here is the human dimension insofar as the crews and the Navy structure is concerned. Even after handover/commissioning, it takes years for a Navy's crews to fully understand the ship. And then begins the process of the Navy itself, its commands, its leadership, its doctrine, to understand what to do with this ship. And my question for Admiral Murdoch, who is obviously having experience with similar problems, is how can we speed up this process?
Do you ever watch the Tour de France every year? Okay. How many people know what the Tour de France looks like, right? So you have this enormous pack of cyclists that go out, and it's the status quo. And then you have a breakaway, and a group of riders will take off. And if they time it right and everything goes right, one of them might win. Doesn't usually happen though, does it? So one by one, they get tired. They're out there pedaling like crazy, and they get reeled back into the pack. Okay, so in a new type of ship program, I can tell you how not to do it, and that's to try and do a breakaway, because you're going to get awfully damn tired of pedaling, as I did in some respects. And eventually the status quo, the let's do it like we've always done it, you'll get absorbed back into the pack, and you'll have to try your hand at it the next day. In my view, going back to Professor Vego's point, there's no substitute for detailed understanding of the operational challenges as you formulate the requirements. If you don't have broad understanding, as best you can discern it, and in the case of Canada here today, how would you employ the future Canadian surface combatant in the Asia-Pacific theater? Figure that out first. I've gotten some good, thoughtful questions about, hey, we probably need a bigger crew because we want a ship that's has more endurance and lethality. I tend to agree. Agree on that internally. So that, I believe, is, that's axiomatic. Understand the operational requirement, the strategic requirement, start there. And then secondly, I would say, while you don't want too many architects and oversight personnel working on the design, neither should you go too low. So you have to seek the right balance in the ship and combat systems design to meet that requirement. And you have to understand the trades. And if you do those two things, if you do proper operational assessment and consensus building within the communities that are going to operate that weapon system, and then you do the proper design preparations and get in all the good esoteric things we heard from Mr. Kim, then you have a much more rapid assimilation of the ship into the fleet. But don't forget the human element. Don't forget that integrated system approach. Don't forget to get agreement that you have to address all of the costs, the training and the sustainment. And a critical part of what I didn't see in Mr. Kim's thinking was, you can design for product, you can design for production, you can thirdly design a ship and combat system for production and ease of maintenance and sustainment throughout its life. That almost always costs more up front, and it's just really hard to sell that idea, okay? Good luck with it. But you have to have a view of that ownership cost in the design. And that, I believe, will put you in a much better place to have a smoother and more rapid fleet introduction. I hope that addresses the question in some manner.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, that question and that answer takes us very roundly to the end of our allotted time. If I could just make a capstone comment on that, I think Admiral Murdoch's comment and the analogy of the Tour de France breakaway, I think actually very nicely summarizes the character of this question. And it's a great conference question, of course, because there's no closed answer to it. But it's very much a dynamic question, and the dynamics of the interaction between the many juxtapositions or subordinate juxtapositions in this question are very much apropos to the topic. One of the, I've noted a few of the many juxtapositions, juxtaposition of theory to practice that Professor Vego outlined. There's a juxtaposition of adaptation timescales, the timescale of development of technology versus the timescale of development of doctrine. There's a juxtaposition which was actually thrown into relief by a news item of a couple of days ago on swarm boats, which raised the question of technological capability versus operational accountability. When you have a swarm of autonomous vehicles, who's responsible for pushing the button when there's a certain programmed intelligence in that? And at the end of the day, going back to the theory versus practice, I think it's very much a question as, and tying it back to the people dimension. A senior USN officer of my acquaintance in many past incarnations said one of his mantras of ship design was that the best ship is the one that gets built. He was a naval architect, but that was his realpolitik of technology, was that speculative technology and technology which is not in the hands of the operators long enough for them to learn how to use it and for them to develop a operational doctrine around the most effective use of their asset, whatever it is no great boon to mankind or navies. And so I think the panelists have done, in my estimation, a terrific job of covering the ground here, and I'd like you to join with me in thanking them for their efforts.